Hey, welcome to How to Cook Stuff. Today we're going to make biscuits, baking powder biscuits. It's a very simple recipe, but it is baking, which means you need to measure accurately. Getting the measurements wrong on pretty much anything you bake is likely to result in something you don't want to eat, or at least something that isn't what you wanted in the first place. So, recipe, I'll post it in the comments below, but we need 2 cups of all-purpose flour. You want a nice flat measurement on that. No heaping cups of flour. Just a nice level cup of flour. There we go. We're going to mix all the dry ingredients together first, and then, well, I'll show you what we're going to do. We need 1 teaspoon of, a half teaspoon, there's a teaspoon, 1 teaspoon of salt. Again, a level measure. We need 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And again, this little lip is there so you can do that. 1, 2. Now, here's where you can sort of depart from the recipe a little bit if you want. If you find that your biscuits aren't rising as much as you would like, then you can add a little bit extra baking powder, but you don't want too much because it changes the flavor, makes it a bit bitter, I guess would be the best way to put that. So I'm just going to mix this up a little bit with my finger. So I'm spreading the salt and the baking powder throughout with the flour and blending that up just gently. Okay, so we have salt, baking powder, flour in there. We need about ½ cup of butter. And we're going to need 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk. Now, you can buy buttermilk a lot of places, but here isn't one of them. So what you can do instead is add a little bit of vinegar. So 1 cup is 250 mils, 3/4 of a cup. I don't have a... Yeah, that's about 3/4. I don't have a measuring cup that shows me cups. For 1½ cups of milk, you want to add 1 teaspoon of vinegar. Just white vinegar is fine. I'm going to add about ½ teaspoon. There we go, a little bit extra, that's fine too. And you let that sit. Give it a little stir and then let it sit for a few minutes, and that'll sour the milk a little bit. And what that does, the acid in the vinegar basically reacts with the baking powder to cause carbon dioxide bubbles, releases carbon dioxide. And that's what causes your biscuits to rise and puff up in the oven. Oh, speaking of the oven, we should turn that on, shouldn't we? There we go. And I'm going to put it on convection. And 220 degrees Celsius, which is about 450 Fahrenheit, I believe. Okay, so now, well, that's heating up. I'm going to get out a baking tray for these. Put there for now. Okay. Now, this is something you do with pastry as well. We're going to cut the butter in. This is about a ½ cup of butter. And you can, some of the ingredients you can wiggle around with a little bit if you want a slightly different effect. If you want them a bit, want your biscuits a bit more buttery, I guess, a bit more rich, a bit richer, you can add a little bit more butter, but you don't want to go too far off of what the recipe says otherwise. I mean, baking is basically chemistry, and if you don't get the chemistry right, you end up making a different thing entirely. Too much butter, and it turns into sort of a pastry rather than a biscuit. So, what we're going to do is cut in the butter, which basically you can do this with your hands. I do it with my hands. I prefer doing it with my hands. You basically just squeeze the butter, squish the butter with the flour to make little teeny weeny pieces of butter coated in flour that are mixed all throughout the dough or the batter, whatever. I guess it's a dough. You can buy a thing called a pastry blender, which is, it's kind of like, makes you look like the kitchen version of Wolverine, I guess. It's a handle with a thing that comes down, and you use it to squish the butter. It's got 3 or 4 blades on the bottom that cut the butter into smaller pieces and then mix it up with the flour. But I find with my hands it works just as well. And then I get a better feel for the dough, and I don't miss any big pieces that I might miss with the blender. When I say pastry blender, it's not like a powered appliance. It's just like 3 or 4 little knives on the end of a handle. All right, so once you've got your butter cut up into the flour, well, into the dry ingredients, I guess there's salt and baking powder in there as well, then we're good. Yeah, no big pieces left. I don't want to add the liquid until I'm more or less ready to put it in the oven, and the oven isn't to temperature yet, so we're going to wait a little minute. Now, once you add the liquid, you want to make sure you don't overwork your dough. That means you don't squish it up too much or knead it too much, because that will make it tough and chewy rather than light and fluffy. Throw that away. I always do this 50-some degrees, so we've got a ways to go yet. Okay, so the oven is at 220, and there are a couple of things I wanted to mention before we actually finish making these. One, baking powder is not the same as baking soda. Baking powder has baking soda in it, but it also has an acid mixed in with it, so that when it hits water or liquid of some sort, it reacts and creates the carbon dioxide. We're adding a little bit more vinegar to increase that reaction, but if we were just to use milk and not buttermilk, it should still work okay, though you might want to use a little bit more baking powder. If you're using baking soda, you need to include some sort of an acid, lemon juice or vinegar or something in your dough in order to trigger that reaction. So baking powder, baking soda, not the same thing, although related. The other thing is that this is a basic recipe. You can do lots of different things with it, though, to change the flavors. You can add little pieces of cheese, whatever you want. If I'm doing cheese, I usually mix it in after the liquid, but today what I want to do is add a little bit of dill. I'm going to add that in before the liquid so I can mix it in with the dry ingredients like I did with everything else. There we go. So I'm going to make little dill biscuits today. You can add pretty much any herb or spice that you like. I've made chili biscuits with cumin and crushed chilies. I've made Italian biscuits with oregano, for example, or you could mix pretty much whatever flavors you want in there. Do be careful about the ratio of dry and wet ingredients. If you put too much stuff in there, too much dry stuff in there, it'll dry the biscuits out. If you put in wet things like cheese or I don't know, fruit or whatever you like in there, then you got to be careful about the balance between wet and dry. But that's about the only thing you need to worry about. Now, when we're adding the buttermilk, I don't know if you can see video or not, camera might not be picking it up, but it looks a bit off, like you wouldn't drink this. That smells a bit vinegary too. We're not going to add it all at once, although you can, probably. We only want to add enough liquid to bring it together into a dough. This might not actually be enough. I might have to add some more milk. Interesting. Yeah, this is not going to come together the way that I want it to. I'm actually not going to add more milk because I think that's enough fat in there. Oh, no, it might come together okay. It's going to be a bit drier than I usually make it, but that's fine. So, there we go. Yes, it is coming together. You have a little bit of extra flour left in the bottom, but that's okay. Actually, we might not. Hooray for science. Measuring and stuff. Alright, so this is coming together nicely, actually. Now remember what I said, you don't want to overwork your dough. You just want to make sure that it's mixed thoroughly. And you can roll this out and cut shapes out of it. You can do pretty much whatever you like. What I usually do, because I'm not particularly fussy with how they look. Roll a ball, squish it down. Roll a ball, squish it down. You want them to be about the same size. same size. They don't have to be exact, but that way they'll bake it about the same size. All right, and that's that. That's that. Wash my hands off. Okay. So pop these into the oven at 220. 220 for about 10 to 15 minutes, well, 8 to 12 minutes. That's what the recipe that I use said, but I find my oven takes a bit longer. Your oven may vary. That's the other thing about baking. You have to know your equipment pretty well to get consistent results. But okay, so we'll check those out when they come out of the oven. Okay, so let's take a look and see how our biscuits are doing. Oh, they look just about good. So we will take them out. Turn off the oven. They're just starting to turn brown on little tips and the edges. Now, I have a confession to make. The first batch of these that I made did not turn out. The dough was just too dry, too firm, and they didn't rise. So I made another batch through the magic of television. Here they are. What I did differently, I added a little bit more baking powder. I used 1 tablespoon of baking powder instead of 2 teaspoons, and I added a bit more milk until the dough was much looser, stickier consistency. Here's a picture of just before I put them in the oven. You can see if you look in the bowl, you can see that the dough is actually quite sticky and loose. It's more of like a spoon drop dough than like a bread dough kind of a consistency. So I will, in the recipe that I post in the description below, I will give you the recipe that I used to make these ones, which turned out quite nicely actually. Too hot. See if I can tear one of these open. Ooh, look how fluffy and flaky that is. Yes, perfect. All those little air bubbles in there that are full of buttery goodness. Delicious. So this is a basic biscuit recipe. You can adapt it pretty much any way you like. If the dough is too dry when you've mixed it together, just keep adding a little bit of milk at a time. Incorporate the milk, mix it together until it's the right sticky kind of goopy consistency, and it'll rise nicely like this. You can add any kind of herbs and flavorings and things you like to make it your own recipe. If you do try this at home, snap some pictures and post in the comments below. Let us see how you did, and let us know how they tasted. Okay, so I guess that's all for today. See you next time, and have fun cooking.